Hi, good afternoon. My name is Dr. Christina Yao, and I'm an associate professor of higher education at the University of South Carolina.
Hi, everyone. My name is Crystal George Mwangi, and I am an associate professor at George Mason University.
So we're really excited to connect with the RIS community today and share how our equity-driven lens for internationalization research can be applied to research with international students. So much of the research on international students tends to be very essentializing and dehumanizing, as depicted by this cartoon that we chose to share with you, which is why we appreciate the work of the Research with International Students group that actively humanizes students as equal and important collaborators on international higher education research. We want to start with this to illustrate the current dehumanizing discourse about international students. And so we always want to start with our purpose for the session. And so briefly, so you know what our learning outcomes are today, in this session, we will describe the equity-driven lens for internationalization research. We will discuss how the equity-driven lens can unpack existing international education research, and also how we can apply the equity-driven lens to research with international students. As we discuss and reflect on how to engage and support international students, Dr. George Mwangi and I are going to use a framework that we developed called the Equity-Driven Lens for Internationalization. Our development of the lens was informed by an extensive review of the literature on the internationalization of U.S. higher education, in which we foregrounded the broad concepts of equity, inequity, and inequity as a way to analyze the literature and examine how these concepts were present and missing in current scholarship. We created this framework to illustrate the complicated network of internationalization. And so within our illustration, you'll see a piece of yarn, which we use as a metaphor for illustrating the internationalization of higher education. Yarn is typically viewed as a singular thread. So just as internationalization can often be viewed as a single broad umbrella term that can overshadow its complexity. However, when you look at it closer, just the same way we illuminate the fibers, yarn is made up of multiple strands of tightly interlocked fibers. So internationalization also reflects the interconnectedness of multiple complex processes, policies, practices, people, communities, and organizations. And so today our focus is on one strand of the yarn, which is specifically on international student mobility. And so the next few parts, will actually go through those four lenses. And the first lens is defining the socio-historical context. So the US has always been a site of internationalization, globalization, colonization, and domination of people, land, and ideas. Current institutional practices cannot be divorced from social and historical events and ideologies that continue to inform contemporary approaches to international education research and practices. So we can pursue equitable approaches by considering socio-historical context and how these contexts serve as foundations for current practices and strategies. One of the major developments of research on international students' experiences in US higher education stemmed from the 1960s and the 1970s, when a number of annotated bibliographies and systematic literature reviews were conducted on student mobility to the United States. These reviews were often sponsored by the US federal government and captured hundreds of articles that typically reflected education or other social science evaluation studies. These reviews focused on international students' adjustment to US higher education, how their travels to the US impacted their values, factors impacting their academic achievement, and peer group composition and engagement. One critique of these reviews is that international student research portrays the student population in very narrow ways, and this critique is not dissimilar to critiques of research on international students' experiences in contemporary times. So in moving forward with research with international students, we suggest using the socio-historical context guiding principle as a tool for critical knowledge production that acknowledges and engages with the past. Some questions for scholars to ponder while conducting international higher education research include, in what larger structures, systems, values, and histories are the experiences of international students embedded? How does social, cultural, historical, racial, economic, and political factors, as well as local and world events, influence how research about international students and research with international students are enacted? And then finally, how do socio-historical events and contexts affect and inform research with international students? So in this session, we also provide some examples of how we, as researchers, apply these concepts to our own studies. So in earlier US history, Asian people in the United States represented the yellow peril, which refers to fear and mistrust of Asian individuals that categorizes Asians as forever foreigners. And as forever foreigners, Asian people were often considered as the other, as positioned against white Americans. And so, since the early 19th century, Asians have been identified as being unable to assimilate and cause competition, disease, and immorality. So, in this paper, we analyze how East Asian international students are positioned within current discourse, particularly during COVID-19, using racist nativism and group positioning theory. We found that Asian international students were simultaneously positioned as scapegoats, bearers of disease, cash cows, and political pawns, all within the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. They were scapegoats who were blamed for the COVID-19 pandemic. The population was blamed for bringing COVID to the US. Cash cows who provided economic benefit to higher ed institutions, and also as political pawns to force institutions to reopen their campuses in the wake of the shifting immigration policies. So this is an example of how we engage deeper with the socio-historical foundations of the United States to provide an analysis of current issues affecting international students. So our second lens that we're going to cover is connecting to forces of globalization. So this takes us out beyond the socio-historical perspective a little bit to talk about current global pressures and issues. Internationalization as a practice is heavily driven by global structures and systems. So simply stated, what happens around the world affects us locally. Thus, researchers must take into consideration how contemporary forces of globalization affect current practice by interrogating how local and world events, with an emphasis on geopolitical factors, may affect the work that we do. So, the commodification of international students reflects a response to market-driven globalization that was present within the literature in three main ways. Each of these three rationales is foundationally true and connected to the economic forces of globalization, but yet using them to center the significance of studying student mobility to the United States and international student experiences reinforces the image that these students value what they can provide to the United States and to higher education institutions, rather than how we can better support their learning, development, and degree completion, which is very dehumanizing to the student population. So, an equity driven lens should also be used to examine the concerns of international student mobility. So, much of the current discourse focuses on how US higher education will lose millions in revenue due to low international student enrollment, which directly affects the US economy. And we definitely saw this during the COVID-19 pandemic. And also, the discourse focuses on graduate students who provide labor for research and teaching assistance, and also portrays international students as resources. So, guided by our equity driven lens, we argue that international students are situated within geopolitical and global economic systems. Thus, scholars should engage in research that questions how international student mobility is a product of, contributes to, and respond to contemporary forces of globalization. So, our equity driven lens reiterates the importance of considering globalization and internationalization of research and practice. And so, as the visual of our lens illustrates, internationalization practices and topics do not occur in values neutral vacuum driven solely by institutional or individual choice. And so, because internationalization is heavily driven by global structures and systems that privilege the needs of the global north, we see that in a neoliberal and a market orientation. Researchers must take into consideration how contemporary forces of globalization affect research and practices related to international higher education, and more specifically, when we talk about the mobility of international students. So, scholars should consider these questions that help interrogate the forces of globalization, such as what are the social, cultural, historical, and racial implications of research with international students? How do local and world events impact how international students are discussed in research? And then finally, what are the economic and political factors that must be examined in research with international students? And so again, another example of some of the work that we've done is that this is an example from an upcoming paper that I believe is actually coming out this fall, I hope, that talks about how international students made sense of politics and policies in the years 2020 and 2021. And as we may remember, those years were filled with contention, including the politicizing of a global virus, a US presidential election, and the January 6th insurrection of the US Capitol. Yet much of the research on international student responses tended to focus on US domestic students and did not include the perspectives of international students. So, findings from the study included concerns about the politicized pandemic, excitement and trepidation at presidential changes, and disbelief over the January 6th Capitol insurrection. Again, this connects to the forces of globalization, especially right now in this moment where we are in the midst of presidential elections, which we have coming up this year in the United States. So I'm going to pass it over to Crystal to go through the next pieces.
Sure. So the next lens is on constructing and deconstructing internationalization. Through our lens, the overarching idea is for you to question what counts or who counts when it comes to internationalization and international students, rather than accept the status quo of who's included and excluded when these concepts are defined. For example, especially when discussing people and places, these students should be disaggregated in terms of understanding their experiences in order to nuance who participates in internationalization. We can deconstruct and then utilize concepts and terminology that are more asset oriented rather than deficit oriented, that are inclusive, that complicate the status quo, and that interrogate dynamics of power and privilege. International student mobility is so diverse, but researchers in the past have often constructed international students' experiences by generalizing research results to all international students as if they reflect a homogeneous or all the same group. This limitation is particularly apparent in quantitative studies with large national data sets. For example, in the United States, these data sources may not capture much demographic data about these students beyond their foreign status. And when demographic data is collected, the small number of international students within a data set can make the ability to analyze within group differences difficult due to producing a small n. In quantitative and qualitative studies, international students are often only disaggregated by national identity, which is also problematic, given that a dominant national group may be used to represent all international students from a particular country or region. Additionally, a sole focus on national identity also ignores students' socioeconomic status, religious identity, ethnic racial identity, linguistic background, sexuality, ability, and other identities. Not acknowledging sociocultural factors and identities beyond national origin presents students as one dimensional and really wrongly suggests that there be, again, a one size fits all approach to meeting their educational needs. It should not be assumed that all international students experience higher education in the same way because of a shared student visa status. By removing this assumption, scholars can acknowledge that international students experience multiple points of privilege and oppression given their multiple intersecting identities at different points in time. As we consider research with international students, even the name of this initiative, RIS, provides a clear example in and of itself. We're not saying that we're conducting research on international students, which treats international students as a variable to be manipulated and dehumanizes this group. The practice of engaging in research with international students focused on in this initiative is another important way to construct and engage scholarship. For example, the term international student and the term domestic student, these labels can create a false binary around students' global engagement and backgrounds. Through an equity-driven lens, a researcher really might reflect on what does it mean to use constructs like domestic or international in equity-driven internationalization research? Given previous research, how might the use of this type of dichotomous language limit portrayals of international students in scholarship? And then implementing research by developing ways to problematize these terms in research designs and dissemination or circulation. Researchers can also reflect on how and why are domestic students with a transnational background, maybe they're naturalized immigrants or children of immigrants or refugees, often excluded from internationalization scholarship. And then really think again about implementation by engaging in inquiry that examines how students experience or engage in internationalization and are presented in that discourse. As I considered constructing and deconstructing within my own previous work, I think of an article I co-wrote with Dr. Nyari Changameyer and Dr. Jackie Molselson, both former international students who are now working as faculty and education practitioners. And we also criticized existing literature on the educational experiences of international students for really combining all international students into one monolithic group and not really accounting for differences in countries of origin, social class, race, religion, or other characteristics. In our study, we emphasized African international students' experiences in the US, and we sought to see students as whole, complex, multifaceted individuals, and used an intersectional lens to ensure that the points of privilege and marginality they experience were brought to bear in the article. Being able to engage with students about not just their academic identity and visa status, but also their socioeconomic status before and after arriving to the United States, their race, their gender, their religion, as well as the experience of being a parent or a partner or spouse, which many of them also experience, or the many other social identities that they found most salient as well, those that they felt were placed on them, were really important to engage around with them. Methodologically, we used an approach called counter storytelling to deconstruct and reject the master narrative that espouses these students as a homogenous group that should assimilate to dominant campus culture. And instead, within their counter stories, student participants' narratives provided opportunities for growing awareness of their challenges, needs, and successes, rather than a focus on whether and how they can change or assimilate. The final lens is integrating equity driven conceptual and theoretical perspectives. An equity driven orientation moves us away from engaging in work in ways that reinforce internationalization broadly or international student enrollment more specifically as a values neutral or indiscriminately positive process. One way to counteract values neutrality in research and practice is through the use of perspectives and frameworks that enable us to look at internationalization and more specifically international student issues and concerns with these students at the center. Research related to international students' experiences have historically been grounded in assimilationist and psychological frameworks focused on coping to understand international student adjustment to their new educational environment. Two of the most often cited frameworks are the concept of culture shock, which defines as stage one experiences as a result of moving into a new cultural environment, and acculturative stress, the stressors one experiences in adapting to the values, beliefs, and practices of a new country context. Seeking to understand international students solely using either framework can foreground their behavior as maladaptive to adjustment challenges, which scholars using these frameworks have found include depression, again, culture shock, non assimilation to dominant culture as a deficit, and lacking agency in their own experience. Assimilation based theories also places the responsibility on international students to adapt to their environment instead of calling on institutions to transform to better support and be inclusive of their international students. Framing scholarship around what international students are lacking rather than on what, where, and how they can be supported in their education environment is problematic within an equity driven lens. As an example of deficit framing, a number of studies have investigated the correlation between English language proficiency and international student well being, finding that students with less English proficiency are often more homesick, anxious, and depressed during college. But an equity driven approach might examine the relationship between international student well being and the support US campuses are and are not providing for students' English language skills development. This type of study would shed light on how US institutions, processes, and services for international students are operating instead of defining international students as deficient. In research with international students, one way to counteract values neutrality in research is through, again, the use of conceptual and theoretical perspectives that enable researchers to critique and disrupt inequity, hegemony, and marginalization, as well as to identify and engage in resistance of inequity and reimagining. A number of scholars are moving scholarship to a more equity driven approach for understanding international students perspectives of these students and their educational experiences and outcomes. Some scholars are using sociological, ecological, culturally sustaining, non-Western, and critical frameworks to consider and critique the role of systems, structures, and environments on international students' experiences. Growing scholarship considers student outcomes during and post-college. Emerging scholarship on students' well-being and sense of belonging is grounded in care for students and not the benefit of these students to higher education institutions. Our equity-driven lens should not be used to replace the integration of critical epistemologies and theories in future research, although it is informed by those approaches. While this may include formal theory or frameworks, you may also find in your research with international students that students' knowledge and lived experiences are more grounding than those kind of formal theories that were not created with these students in mind. We'd also argue that just being reflective of how our experiences, positioning, and perspectives influence our behavior is also very powerful. Specifically, what concepts, assumptions, and beliefs guide the work that you're doing with international students should best be explored and tackled as you engage in that work. And really thinking about questions such as, what theoretical or conceptual perspectives are helping to foreground equity in the research questions in order to center international students. How are they providing guidance towards literature that resists values neutral and hegemonic perspectives or supports a critique of literature that does? How do they inform methodology and methods to embed power and equity into the research design? And how do these perspectives support integration of the larger structures, systems, values, and histories that international students are embedded within? In my own research, I want to briefly discuss a study that I worked on with Dr. Sharon Friesbrett and Dr. Alicia Peralta many years ago that led to the development of a new framework when the conceptual and theoretical perspectives of racial and ethnic identity development just didn't seem to work for understanding the experiences of international students who were racially Black in the United States. Our research was initially informed by those models, and we found that in our research that many of these models, just weren't really fitting, that they were developed within a socio-historical and socio-political context relating back to Black nationalism, the civil rights movement in the US, and other racial pride movements that situate Black identity in reaction to US anti-Black systems and structures. Thus, Black racial identity development models have an inherent focus on US-centric concepts of Blackness that derive as a response to living and coping with a hostile, racially oppressive US environment. But that's not necessarily how international students who are racially Black were socialized around their Blackness in their home country or perceive and experience their Black racial identity. So we listened to our student participants and built a framework that was informed by existing theories, but really kind of came from the unique and distinct racial understandings that these students were having. And so that was really important to engage around and to build framing and not just kind of copy and paste what's been done before. As we close, we return to the visual on the equity-driven lens for internationalization, and we hope that this talk has given you more to consider and how you can use it to engage research with international students. And I just would like to pose a few final reflection questions. That is, whose experiences are centered or ignored within international student research and research with international students? What are the perspectives and values informing how we define and enact research with international students? What larger structures, systems, values, and histories is our research with international students embedded within? And how can our research with international students continue to be imagined and reimagined to be transformative for practices in higher education? Thank you so much for listening to this talk, and please feel free to be in touch if you have any questions or comments about what we've presented. Thanks again.